Okay, everyone, welcome back to our investigation. So, a viewer contacted me the other day and said, why do you keep saying that HHS does not recommend water fluoridation, right? Because when this individual goes to the HHS website, it appears that HHS is recommending water fluoridation. And I said, no, 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 take a closer look. It says that the Public Health Service recommends the optimal ion concentration. Now, why is this important? Well, I've gone over this in the past. It's because the devil's in the details, in my opinion. So when, a legal case comes out, if and when a legal case comes out, perhaps against the Virginia Department of Health, the judge is going to look to see what does the Virginia Administrative Code actually say, right? So it says that the board, meaning the Virginia Department of Health board, recommends the optimal ion concentration as determined by Health and Human Services. And then the judge is going to say, well, what does Health and Human Services say? Well, they actually don't say anything. Health and Human Services is the agency that puts out the notices for the Public Health Service, okay? The devil is in the details. So I thought I would dive into this a little bit deeper because it seems to trip people up. I know that when I have mentioned this to some of the Henrico Board of Supervisors and the DPU director, they kind of look at me with this like, what the heck are you talking about, right? And perhaps what's happening is people's attention span is all of about 5 seconds, and they just see Health and Human Services on the website and they think, bingo, it says Health and Human Services, so she's wrong. No soup for you. So let's go over to the various websites so I can explain a little bit further. Okay, let's go. Let's read the information together. So we are looking at 12 VAC 5-590 930 fluoridation. And it says the board, meaning the Virginia Department of Health board, recommends that all community waterworks in Virginia be optimally fluoridated. They go on to say that fluoridation feed systems shall be designed to deliver the optimal fluoride ion concentration as determined by the United States Department of Health and Human Services. Now, this is important because technically speaking, the board recommends essentially whatever HHS is recommending. But the devil is in the details. Health and Human Services does not recommend water fluoridation. Who recommends water fluoridation? It's the Public Health Service. I think this would matter, especially if there is a lawsuit that occurs later on down the road. One might say, well, was Henrico following the Virginia Administrative Code? Technically speaking, no, because Henrico is taken on the recommendation of the Public Health Service, not the Department of Health and Human Services. There is a difference. Even though the Public Health Service is underneath HHS, there is actually a difference, okay? So let's see where some of the confusion may occur. So if one were to look up Health and Human Services and fluoride, what would you find on the internet that might confuse you? Okay, let's go over to this document right here. This comes from the Federal Register. And the title reads, Proposed HHS Recommendation for Fluoride Concentration in Drinking Water for Prevention of Dental Caries. So this is confusing to a lot of people because it says that HHS recommendation for fluoride concentration, right? But let's look a little bit closer. you'll see it's not actually HHS making the recommendation, it's the Public Health Service. So it says a notice by the Health and Human Services Department. This is not unusual. Health and Human Services puts out notices regarding the CDC. They put out notices regarding the FDA, but it is technically not HHS who is making the recommendations. Okay, so let's go a little bit further. So this was in January 13th, 2011. This is important because in 2011 is when HHS got sued regarding water fluoridation. So this actually matters. Again, if somebody were to continue reading, they see Department of Health and Human Services. So one might think, well, this is HHS, making the recommendations. It is not. You will see. We've got, again, Office of Secretary, Department of Health and Human Services. But you've got to continue to read on. It says the Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, seeks public comment on proposed new guidance which will update and replace the 1962 U.S. Public Health Service drinking water standards related to recommendations for fluoride concentrations in drinking water. They say the Public Health Service recommendations for optimal fluoride concentration were based on ambient air temperature of geographic areas and range from 0.7 to 1.2 milligrams per liter, or as I like to say, parts per million. So guys, just because HHS is putting out the notice, right, does not actually mean just because HHS seeks public comment and they're putting out the notice does not mean they are the ones making the recommendation. It is going to be the Public Health Service, okay? Technically speaking, it is the Public Health Service. I do think this matters, especially in a legal case. So let's continue. Okay, so here is the Public Health Service Drinking Water Standards, 1962. That this got replaced. You could read it if you like and go through the information. It's kind of lengthy. Okay, so again, we're at the Federal Register. And the title says Public Health Service recommendation for fluoride concentration in drinking water for prevention of dental caries. Okay, a notice by the Health and Human Services Department on 5/1/2015. So Health and Human Services just put out the notice. Health and Human Services did not actually make the recommendation. HHS is not making a recommendation on water fluoridation. I know it can, kind of trip you up because you keep seeing, the Department of Health and Human Services. So one could, if you just glanced at this really quickly, you might think HHS is recommending water fluoridation, but you have got to continue to keep reading, folks. It says, through the final recommendation, the United States Public Health Service updates and replaces its 1962 drinking water standards related to community water fluoridation. Okay, so technically speaking, it is the United States Public Health Service that is making the recommendation of water fluoridation. So if push comes to shove and lawsuits come rolling out, somebody's going to say, well, for example, Henrico's defense is we are following the guidance of Virginia Department of Health. And actually, you are not, because the guidance of Virginia Department of Health says to deliver the optimal ion concentration as determined by the Department of Health and Human Services. As you see, Health and Human Services does not make any sort of recommendation, okay? So it is the Public Health Service that makes the recommendation. It is the public health service that makes the recommendation. It is the public health service that makes the recommendation. It is not HHS. And even though the public health service is underneath HHS, I think it actually matters. Okay, let's continue. What is the public health service? Because a lot of people are unfamiliar with this. So you could go to Wikipedia. I thought it was a pretty easy explanation. And it says that the United States Public Health Service is a collection of agencies of the Department of Health and Human Services, right? So Health and Human Services has a bunch of agencies, and there's a collection together which makes up the Public Health Service. I think it's 13 different agencies, one being the CDC. So you could go and read this on Wikipedia and see what the 10 of the 13, okay, here we go. 10 of the 13 operating agencies within the Department of Health and Human Services are designated as part of the Public Health Service. So we have the National Institutes of Health, FDA, CDC, Health Resources and Service Administration, Agency for Toxic Substance and Disease Registry, Indian Health Service, Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration, Administration for Strategic Preparedness and Response, Advanced Research Projects, Agency for Health. Okay, let's continue. Here's an example of the public, HHS putting out a notice. Now, this is what I mean. Okay, HHS put out a notice, and one might think, well, this is actually coming from HHS, when in fact it is not. You have to keep reading. It says the FDA begins action to remove ingestible fluoride prescription drug products for children from the market. So just because HHS puts out the notice does not mean that HHS is actually taking action or making a recommendation. Okay, this matters. This is almost like HHS is the parent and FDA is the child, or HHS is the parent and the Public Health Service is the child. Just because the child says something doesn't mean that the parent is saying it, right? So let's continue on this, because this just explains how this fluoride house of cards is crumbling down. So I'll just read this really quickly. The United States Food and Drug Administration today announced that it is initiating action to remove concentrated ingestible fluoride prescription drug products for children from the market. Unlike toothpaste with fluoride or fluoride rinses, these products are swallowed and ingested by infants and toddlers, right? The same as water. So FDA is saying, hey, this stuff is a problem and they're ingesting it, so we need to stop, which is why we need to stop putting this fluoride in the drinking water as well. They have also never been approved by the FDA. Now, this is true. So the fluoride tablets and drops have never been FDA approved. And the hydrofluorosilicic acid that Henrico County is putting in the drinking water has never been approved by the FDA either. That is not FDA. Okay. Ingested fluoride has been shown to alter the gut microbiome, which is of magnified concern given the early development of the gut microbiome in children, because it kills off everything, right? Well, that's a little bit hyperbole. It kills off, good bacteria, okay? They go on to say, other studies have suggested an association between fluoride and thyroid disorders, weight gain, and possible decreased in IQ. And they go on to say that the best way to prevent cavities in children is by avoiding excess sugar intake and good dental hygiene, not by altering a child's microbiome. For the same reason that fluoride may kill bacteria on teeth, it may also kill intestinal bacteria important for a child's health, said FDA Commissioner Marty Makary, MD, PhD. Quote, I am instructing the Centers for Drug Evaluation and Research to evaluate the evidence regarding the risk of systemic fluoride exposure from FDA regulated pediatric ingestible fluoride prescription drug products to better inform parents and the medical community on this emerging area when it comes to children. We should err on the side of safety. And the agency has set a goal date of October 31st to remove this fluoride tablets so children cannot have it. Which again is why Henrico County, if they actually followed the science, then they would understand, and ethics. I mean, who cares if something is great? It's not ethical to put fluoride in the drinking water and expose everyone. It is considered mass medication. Go read the Delaney report if you don't believe me. All right, so let's go over to this lawsuit really quickly that happened years ago. So I keep letting the Board of Supervisors know that, the Virginia Administrative Code says to follow HHS. HHS does not recommend water fluoridation. HHS got sued in 2011 and had the Public Health Service recommend water fluoridation at 0.7 parts per million. So this is the lawsuit. Federal lawsuit could limit fluoride in drinking water. It did limit the fluoride in the drinking water. And what was the big issue? It caused IQ deficit. It causes thyroid problems. This lawsuit was brought on by the Environmental Protection Agency, brought against the Environmental Protection Agency by groups including the Fluoride Action Network, Food and Water Watch, and Moms Against Fluoridation. So, and it says, would compel the agency to require local water utilities to stop adding fluoride to tap water. So people have been fighting this, such as the Fluoride Action Network, we know about them, and Food and Water Watch, and Moms Against Water Fluoridation. So good on them for, for sticking with this for so long. It's incredible. Okay, one last thing I want to show you. So, let's see. Okay, if you go over to Aaron Series' website, Delivering Justice Nationwide. So let's look. This is Aaron Seary, if you're not familiar, is a lawyer. He has a law firm, Seary and Glimstad, and he is fighting for medical freedom, right? So particularly for vaccines, he is fighting against vaccine mandates, really informed consent. He does a lot of great work. You can check him out on the High Wire if you're not familiar with the High Wire. What do I want to show you? Okay, so Aaron Seary said this. Nope, that's not what I want. Aaron Seary said this one day ago. Hey, at Pam Bondi, why are you fighting against protecting children? After years of litigation, an Obama-appointed federal judge found fluoride in drinking water poses an unreasonable risk of reduced IQ in children, ordered the EPA to revisit its standards, and you're going to fight against the decision by now appealing. So the EPA appealed the case. Shameful. Looks like Michael Conant will have to beat you guys again, this time on appeal. And then this was the appeal brief by the EPA. Now, let me show you what's going on here because this is absolutely insane. Okay, so I want to go to one section in the appeal. This is on like page 3. It says now this is the EPA telling the judge, this is the EPA appealing. It says if plaintiffs had established standing, reversal is warranted on at least 2 independent legal grounds. Okay, so this is their argument. First, the district court violated the Toxic Substance Control Act, Section 21, by permitting plaintiffs to rely on evidence not first presented to the EPA in the petition and reviewed by the EPA in denying the petition. What they're saying is when Michael Conant and his team petitioned the EPA to stop adding artificial fluoride to the drinking water, the EPA is claiming that they didn't submit the pieces of evidence when they submitted that petition, right? So this case went on for 7 years, and more evidence came out within that 7 years. And so the EPA is saying, hey, it's not fair that you had additional evidence to prove that it's harmful. That's what they're claiming. It's not fair that you had more evidence of harm, right? Judge, you've got to reverse this because they used additional evidence to prove that fluoride is harmful. Okay? They go on to say the court's final merits ruling overwhelmingly relied on voluminous evidence that did not exist at the time of the original petition. So the EPA, who was supposed to protect us, says, hey, this is not fair, Judge. They provided overwhelmingly relied on voluminous evidence that did not exist at the time of the original petition. So EPA is not saying like, no, fluoride is actually really safe. No, EPA is saying, hey, we don't think it was fair that Michael Conant provided voluminous evidence of harm. Okay? That's what our government is doing. And says, and which was therefore not presented in the petition to the EPA. It says the court's approach of allowing this consideration of new evidence on a rolling basis throughout the proceedings is contrary to statutory text and frustrates the purpose of Toxic Substance Control Act Section 21's mandatory exhaustion requirement. If allowed to stand, the court's approach would transform Section 21 from a citizen's petition provision into a driving force of the entire statutory scheme. Such a boundless approach to Section 21 would undermine EPA's ability to meet TSCA's prioritization, risk evaluation, and risk management deadline, and it would require EPA to proceed to risk management with a record insufficient to satisfy TSCA's rigorous scientific and regulatory standards. Yeah, right. Okay, now this is what else is just fascinating. Okay, this is the second reason EPA says that the court should reverse everything. The appeals court should reverse everything. Second, the district court abused its discretion by commandeering the trial and administrative proceedings in violation of the party presentation principle. In particular, the court refused to rule after the close of evidence. What happened was Michael Conant, let the judge know that the National Toxicology Program report was due to come out. The EPA colluded with others in the government to prevent the judge from seeing the National Toxicology report. Now, if you're not familiar with the National Toxicology Program, That is an agency under HHS. So EPA is saying, hey, it's not fair that the judge said, I would like to see that evidence that Michael Conant wished to submit for this trial. EPA doesn't care about the truth, right? It has nothing to do with truth. EPA understands that fluoride is harmful. They understand that. They're not debating that it's harmful. They just say they don't think it's fair that the judge was allowed to look at voluminous evidence of harm. That's what they're saying. The judge should not have been allowed to look at evidence. So again, in particular, the court refused to rule after the close of evidence at the first trial, notwithstanding the parties' insistence that the case was ready for resolution, and in the face of the court's repeated acknowledgement that it had serious concerns about plaintiff's standing. This and the court's determination to accumulate more evidence that it, rather than the parties, thought proper, transformed the court from a neutral arbitrator into an advocate, and transformed TSCA Section 21 from a citizen's petition provision into a license for judicial rulemaking. Essentially, they're saying that the EPA is saying, we don't think the judge should have been allowed to read the science. We don't think the judge should have been allowed to do judicial review. We don't think the judge should be able to know what the truth is. We think the judge should have, not looked at the evidence and ruled in our favor. The EPA, again, is not saying that fluoride is safe. They're just saying they don't think the judge should be able to look at the evidence of harm. The EPA acknowledges it's harmful. I can't. I'm interested to see what Michael Conant's side is going to submit in response to this. It's going to be a while before Michael Conant responds. So let's get out of this. Okay, guys, so it's a bit insane, don't you think? The EPA is appealing the case not because artificial fluoride is safe. The EPA says, we don't think it was fair that the judge had judicial review and looked at the science and looked at the evidence. That's what EPA is saying. Now, EPA is supposed to protect you and me, but that's not what they're doing. The EPA is protecting industry. So the EPA says, we're going to appeal this because we don't think it was fair that the judge looked at science and evidence, the voluminous amount of science and evidence, right? So everyone knows that this stuff is bad, except for the county of Henrico, right? So how did this all get started? The county of Henrico, they have no idea why they're putting this stuff in the drinking water, right? They've got no records as to the purpose, the justification, the adverse events, nothing. Henrico County says, well, we defer to Virginia Department of Health, right? And as I've shown you, Virginia Department of Health defers to Health and Human Services. Health and Human Services defers to the Public Health Service, and the Public Health Service, those recommendations got updated with the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act. The Federal Safe Drinking Water Act put EPA in charge, and under EPA you have the Toxic Substance Controls Act, which is required to look at whether or not chemicals are causing harm. And Michael Conant found mountains of evidence that shows that artificial fluoride does in fact cause harm to people. But the EPA says, we don't think it's fair that the judge was able to look at the science So the EPA doesn't want to ban artificial fluoride under TSCA, not because it's not bad, but because they say it wasn't fair that the judge had judicial review and looked at evidence. In which case, if the when the EPA refuses to put a ban on artificial fluoride, then essentially what happens is because EPA gave primacy to VDH, VDH says, well, EPA doesn't want to ban it because they don't think it was fair that the judge looked at evidence. So if EPA doesn't ban it, then VDH says, well, we're not going to stop recommending it on our website, but just to cover our a CYA, we're going to put on the Virginia Administrative Code to follow HHS, knowing good and well it's not HHS doesn't make the recommendation. It's the Public Health Service who makes the recommendation. So VDH is covered because technically they never actually recommended water fluoridation, nor does HHS recommend water fluoridation. But VDH essentially manipulates and brainwashes localities such as Henrico into thinking that VDH and HHS are recommending water fluoridation, knowing good and well they do not. And then Henrico, I come along and tell Henrico, you are being bamboozled. There's this whole web of nonsense, and ultimately the responsibility is on Henrico. Stop deferring. What are you doing? You're the ones putting the drugs in the water. Stop deferring. Stop outsourcing your brains to the so-called authorities. What is the truth, right? Let's go with the truth instead of authority, right? Because that's what science does, is we're supposed to look at the truth, right? But everybody wants to talk about their feelings. Facts don't care about feelings. I'm sorry that Henrico got bamboozled by Virginia Health Department. But what is the truth? The truth is that this is a toxic substance. The EPA knows it. Virginia Department of Health knows it, right? So Henrico, I strongly encourage you to get off this bandwagon. You are absolutely being bamboozled. And I hope that I explained this issue of, the Virginia Administrative Code says HHS, when HHS doesn't technically recommend water fluoridation. It's the Public Health Service. Again, just because the Public Health Service is under HHS doesn't mean that HHS is recommending it. I really do think the devil is in the details. I think this matters. There is, nuance to this, right? So, that's all I have to say about that. I hope you guys understand what's going on. I know it's hard to, keep track of everything. I know these videos get a little bit lengthy, but when we're talking about science and law and politics and ethics, they're all intertwined. So it's difficult for me to do, a 10-minute video in order to cover all of this, because it really is there's a hierarchy to everything, and there's a scheme as to what's going on. So just to put it simply, is fluoride safe to ingest? No. Let's pretend like it is safe to ingest. Is it ethical to put hydrofluorosilicic acid in the drinking water and expose everybody to this mineral, if you guys want to call it a mineral, if that makes you feel a little bit better inside, we can call it a mineral, right? We can use that word instead of the EPA definition contaminant, because that word sounds scary. We can call it a mineral. Is it ethical to put this mineral in the drinking water, especially given the fact that Henrico has no idea what the purpose or justification or adverse events of this is? Anyway, that's all I have to say about that. I think I am going to go out and go vote today, you know. So that's all I have. Bye, guys.